Hi everyone, my name's Mia Dunphy and I'll be hosting today's webinar on how to effectively communicate your research. Firstly though, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all watch or participate from today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. So to kickstart, for those who don't really know much about RAID, RAID stands for Researchers in Agriculture for International Development, and we were founded in 2013 to support early to mid-career researchers in connecting, engaging and supporting those with an interest in agriculture and international development. We are a program of the Crawford Fund and are also strongly supported by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, or ACR. The link of our website has just been posted in the chat window now, and so you can click on that in your own time if you'd like, and also the Crawford website is there too. So this webinar is a bit different to the previous ones you may have watched. This is brought to you by the RAID Capacity Building team. So the Capacity Building portfolio of RAID aims to support career development of early to mid-career researchers through targeted capacity building initiatives. So in the past, we have delivered workshops on digital data collection. We have recently wrapped up a series of 6 agriculture research leadership and management workshops across Australia, targeted especially at early career researchers and professionals. In the post-COVID world, this is our first webinar style seminar to our members, but we are working on bringing you many more workshops and seminars in the future. In that case, please let us know through the chat function and through our social media channels what topics would be of interest to you from a skill development perspective. And we will also have a link to the survey at the conclusion of this webinar for you to express your ideas about future webinar ideas. So we have 3 incredible women lined up today who I couldn't think of anyone better to discuss how to talk science in a more people-friendly, engaging way. So in order of speaking, we have Elizabeth Brennan. So Elizabeth can talk farmer in multiple languages. She currently lives and works on her family farm in Wongang Hills, 2 hours northeast of Perth, and travels to Papua New Guinea regularly for work in multidisciplinary agricultural research for development with ACR and DFAT. She currently has a number of leadership positions in the regional development and agricultural industries, including 2 ministerial appointments, various NFPs and an ASX listed company. Elizabeth is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a fellow with the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. Next, we have Dr. Jenny Metcalf. Dr. Jenny is a founder of eConnect Communication, which was established in 1995 to help scientists communicate their research. As a science communicator for more than 30 years, she has worked as a journalist, practitioner, university lecturer and researcher. Jenny is a foundation member of the Australian Science Communicators and has been a member of the Scientific Committee of the International Public Communication of Science and Technology Network since 1996. Jenny is a campus visitor at the Australian National University's Centre for Public Awareness and Science, and Jenny believes every person has the right to engage with science so they can make more informed decisions about issues that affect their lives. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jenn Martin. Dr. Jenn spent many years working as a field ecologist until she decided the most useful thing she could contribute as a scientist was to teach other scientists how to be effective and engaging communicators. Jenn founded, leads and teaches the University of Melbourne's acclaimed science communication teaching program. She is deeply committed to helping scientists develop their skills they need to be visible, make connections, and have impact. Jenn also practices what she preaches. With 15 years discussing science on radio, writing popular blogs and magazines, she was also named last year's Unsung Hero of Australian Science Communication and travelled to Antarctica in the late 2019 as a member of the Homeward Bound teaching faculty. So before we hear from these absolutely fantastic speakers, I'll just let you know a little bit about how this webinar will run. So our panelists will each present for approximately 10 minutes. And then after all three presentations, there will be a Q&A session. So anytime you wish to ask a question, please write it within the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, which should say Q&A. We will be monitoring this and not the chat for questions. You can also boost a question up to the top of the Q&A window if you would really like to hear that question. If you're viewing this from Facebook Live, please add questions in the comment section and they will be delivered to me. So first up, we have Elizabeth Brennan discussing how to communicate with impact. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Take it away.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Mia, and hello all. I'm going to share my screen now and then I will get into a bit of an introduction. So bear with me as I navigate. Of course, there we are. So of course it's not going to work when you need it to. Beautiful. Okay, fantastic. So, hello everyone. As was mentioned earlier, I'm based in the WA wheat belt, and at the moment I'm actually in Perth. So I would like to acknowledge that I am presenting from the land of the Whadjuk people and our family farm on Balladong country and Uwed country. So I grew up in Wongan and still am based there, so 2 hours northeast of Perth. And about 10 years ago, a friend of mine and I walked the Kokoda track, and I found myself falling in love with Papua New Guinea and relocated there about 6 months later. And for someone who had lived in a very small country town, 750 people, I became very quickly aware of how it is that I was going to exist in a new country. And one of the most powerful ways that I discovered to, get by in Papua New Guinea was around storying. So I've kind of since made a bit of a career out of sharing stories, and so my presentation would be largely as a practitioner rather than a researcher. So I have an agricultural background. Right, so I've got 5 points that I wanted to talk to you about today. And the first one is seek to understand, then to be understood. And that's really around understanding your audience. So I have often seen in the agricultural industry where a sales rep or a researcher lob into a community like they're the authority and they have very little understanding of the context, and we like to have these experts and whatnot, but often they don't really understand the context of which they're working. I guess the second point is farmers have such a valuable, are such a valuable knowledge source, and there's such a great opportunity to learn from them. And I guess in the context of research, it's such a wonderful opportunity to have farmers involved in research design, so it is targeted and whatnot. The third point around seeking to understand is one of the most powerful things that I've found is the power of saying that you don't know the answer. There's been a lot of recent, leadership research that's demonstrated the power of vulnerability in creating relationships, which is so critical to being able to communicate. And the last couple of points on this one is using appropriate language. Often when I say that I work in food security, I've had really bizarre responses saying, is food security making sure that China doesn't steal our food? Or are they really food burglars? So just being really clear when you're talking about particular terminology that it is using common language and language that's suited to the audience. The other thing that I find often when communicating, it is important to use metrics that are easily understood. So, you know, when I say that our family farm is, you know, 4,000 hectares or 10,000 acres, people just hear the numbers and they don't understand the context. So it's often really good to put it in terms that people understand. For example, 1 hectare is about half the size of the MCG. Rightio. The second point I'd like to make is around communicating with impact and ensuring that you have an elevator pitch. And this is the point around having a story. 2006 and 7, I worked for a renewable energy company, and one of my colleagues actually won the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry Science Award. And I was to accompany him to Canberra. It's the first time I'd ever been to Canberra, and I was in a room full of scientists. And it was a networking event with all the finalists. And I was the only non-research or science background. And it was one of the most painstaking experiences of my life, because people would tell me about their research and it would take 5 minutes to get there. And I was really struck by the fact that all of these wonderful, knowledgeable individuals had very little communication skills. So I would challenge you, I'm certain that most science degrees now do, or science degrees and research roles do have a communication component, but I would encourage you to develop your skills further. A great example, which is actually, this is by a farmer. We've got a lady, a sheep farmer down south, Belinda Lay. She was the 2019 WA Rural Women's Award winner last year. And her award was given to her because of some research that she was doing into sheep collars, or sorry, GPS live trackers that sheep wear to monitor their movement, where they were eating, and it was largely for ewes, pregnant ewes, to monitor birth and whatnot. And one thing that she did really cleverly to communicate that, her research project in a really short time, was sheep Fitbits. Now, people understand that. It's not a language that people get. So, and this, in fact, I pulled this particular comic from her Twitter feed. So, yeah. Rightio. The third thing I want to talk about is values-based communication. So most people remember where they were when Diana passed away. I remember exactly where I was when the 2011 live export ban or debacle hit the media. And it was a watershed moment for the agricultural industry, because we couldn't continue business as usual. Post-industrial revolution, we had mouths to feed and with little consideration about how it was done. But in recent years, this has changed and priorities for food production have shifted. And it has really necessitated a social license to operate becoming the new normal. So in 2012, myself and another lady founded a business that enabled farmers and cattle farmers, in this particular case, to communicate effectively their story and understanding what it was like, what the care that they took in raising cattle. And some of the tools that we used were around values-based communication. So being able to have a conversation with, generally speaking, people interested in knowing how food is produced. This values-based communication is actually finding areas of commonality so you can communicate and you can find a thread to connect with your audience. Rightio. Okay, one thing that I feel very strongly about as a farmer and as someone who works in the ag industry is the way in which we message. And how important it is to bring people along. So we have this really wonderful way of creating us versus them, and I've seen it both in the Australian agriculture industry, but also in the research world. So biophysical scientists versus social researchers. I've seen this again and again in PNG, and similarly in Australia with conventional farmers versus regen farmers. You know, the bloody hicks versus the bloody hippies, you know, conventional versus regen farmers. And I guess my point is that there's room for both. It doesn't need to be either or. In fact, you can actually learn a lot from each other. So this particular bumper sticker really irks me because it's such a righteous statement from a farming community, but it's actually missing an opportunity to engage with people. The point here is that you must be really careful of the language you're using to ensure that people are brought along. Yeah, rightio. My last point is around the courage to be disliked and the courage to be who you are. People have really good, I won't swear, bull dust meters, and so I would encourage, if anything, be authentic. As I mentioned, be okay with saying that you don't know something. I have, I'm mimicking Dr. Carl with my veggie dress on today and his strawberry shirt, but I take every opportunity to have conversations with people, because it's actually the everyday conversations that make a difference. And yeah, in a time, it was actually someone's bio, where fake news trumps facts, it's so important that we are able to communicate science and researchers and practitioners, where we can create these spaces for nuanced discussion, and again, bringing people along. So that's it from me.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. That was such a engaging and informative presentation. It was like, it's so great to hear stories and in particular, how you emphasized how researchers need to deeply understand the communities they work in, and the power of vulnerability. It's so important. So thank you. So yeah, just wanted to reiterate, if you wanted to ask a question, please again use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen or in the Facebook comments. That's where we will be looking. And before we move on to our next panel member, we just wanted to take a minute to ask 2 poll questions for the audience. So these questions will give us a greater idea about where you're coming from as attendees, and so it'll help us create future workshops to kind of suit our audience. So yeah, please answer those questions. That would be awesome. And then we'll move on to our awesome Jenny. All right, I'll give maybe 15 more seconds and then we'll move on. Great. All right, I'll end that and then I can share the results. Some interesting results there for anyone who might be interested. All right, I might stop that one. Okay. All right, now we have Jenny, who will be discussing participatory ways to communicate. Thanks so much, Jenny. Take it away.
Thanks, Mia. First of all, I'd like to say that I feel over my 30+ years working as a science communicator, that I feel so privileged to meet the sort of people that I've met and worked with across the world. I noticed Kathy Reid, who's the Communication Director Extraordinaire of the Crawford Fund, is also online. And I've been privileged, for example, to work with Kathy in a number of countries running masterclasses in science communication. And today I'm going to tell you about 3 of those stories that have really made a mark on my life. And I've learned as much from them, I'm sure, as they've learned from me. So, participatory science communication. Well, today I'm going to, as I said, talk about 3 stories, and they're set, first of all, in the Philippines, particularly in the island of Mindanao to the south. They're set in Australia, and they're also set more recently in Namibia in Africa. So 3 different parts of the world that I have travelled to and been lucky enough to interact with the local people. So the first one started in 2003 when ACR commissioned me to write the stories of Landcare in the Philippines. And this was a wonderful learning story for me that created this book. Now, you'll notice the man in the right-hand corner. His name is Basilio Decano, and he lives in an upland area in Landcare, a part of Mindanao. This is the sort of country that these smallholder farmers farm in. Very steep, and you can see towards the middle of the screen there that some of the ploughing is down the hill, which really doesn't help with issues of soil erosion, which ultimately leads to the loss of livelihoods. So it's a tough country, and this program was very much about supporting farmers to farm more sustainably. And it was Landcare, like in Australia, was very much driven by the farmers that were in the Philippines, particularly this part of the Philippines in Mindanao. This photo is, the gentleman on the left-hand side is Gerardo Boy, his name is, and he was one of the Landcare facilitators that I worked with. In preparing this book, we worked with the facilitators to go out and interview people so that they told their own stories. And that developed the skills of the facilitators, but it also meant that they learnt about the stories of the people that they were working with in a lot more depth. Often these were in their own language, and we had to get them translated before I got them and was able to edit them. Now, I mentioned Basilio Decano. Here he is here with his grandson and a goat, and in the background is an agroforestry. But Basilio wasn't always into Landcare, and I want to read you a little bit of the story that he told Gigi Boy and myself about how he got into Landcare. I was probably one of the most hard-headed farmers the Landcare facilitators had ever encountered. I was approached 7 times by the facilitators, but I always hid my face and instead sent my wife along to meetings. Why? Well, I thought the Landcare program was the same as the government's reforestation watershed project, where farmers were encouraged to plant their farms with trees. Farmers were given 1,200 pesos or 30 Australian dollars for every hectare that they planted for the project. Many of my neighbouring farmers were enticed by the money, but then had problems because they could not plant anything else on that land or harvest the trees for their own use. However, in 1999, when I went on a field trip to Bavaria, I saw that there was hope for farmers who are poor. After that momentous trip, the first thing I did with 2 other farmers was to construct a simple nursery and spend a lot of time in managing it. Many of our neighbours laughed and teased us, but we didn't mind their comments and just persevered. And I think his story reminds us of the importance of understanding the context that these people work in. What is it that's stopping them join? For Basilio, it was very much his fear of what the government might do if he joined, and thinking that Landcare was just another government initiative. The Landcare approach is very much a collaboration between farmers, the local government and the technical facilitators. And they work together very much within small communities called barangay to make these things work. Here we are, here's Basilio now. He's really part of the Landcare movement, and now he has farmers from his local area and from wider afield in the Philippines coming to see how he's developed agroforestry on his property. Here he is with his children and grandchildren. A large extended family is now supported by the initiatives that he's put into on his property. So the lessons learned from this first story is that it's important to understand their concerns and needs and their context. It's important to provide opportunities for farmers to learn from other farmers, to allow time for relationships of trust to develop. And remember that they also have knowledge that's important. And that's why it's so important that farmers participate with scientists and others on projects like this. The second story is about the climate champion farmers in Australia. This was something that I worked with the Managing Climate Variability Program and the GRDC in 2009 to put together. The aim of the project was very much about based on the fact that farmers learn best from other farmers. And so We got farmers from around Australia in lots of different industries, from beekeeping to extensive cattle grazing, to come and mix with scientists and learn more about climate science and climate risk and how they could manage that risk. We had, over the time of the program, about 45 farmers spread all around the country, except for the Northern Territory. We tried very hard in the Northern Territory, but in the end weren't able to get anyone involved in the program. This was a program that changed lives, and it changed my life as well. Here are two of the scientists that were involved in the program. On the left is Andrew Watkins from the Bureau of Meteorology, and on the right is Graham Anderson from the Victorian Department of Agriculture. They attended every workshop we had, every meeting we had, and we tried to have 2 or 3 a year where they mixed formally and informally with the farmers. But in between those times, there were a lot of things going on. And Sarah Cole, who used to be one of our team, every day she was like a marriage broker, providing support to both scientists and farmers to interact with each other. But they were so successful at this interaction that in the end, they were able to develop relationships of trust and contact each other independently. Some of the farmers actually became personal friends of the scientists involved in the program. And it's these strong relationships of trust, which I looked at as part of my PhD, which were really made this program effective in its communication. I've got three of these champions to show you. This is Robert Quirk. He's a cane farmer in northern New South Wales, where he's forever trying to battle raising sea levels. And so he sows his cane on mounds. He also tries to farm in a sustainable fashion. And he's been interacting with researchers and continues to all the time. And they learn from him and he learns from them. Now, there's an interesting connection with our next climate champion farmer. This is David Brewer. And he has a number of vineyards in South Australia, particularly in the Adelaide Hills, and produces a very fine wine, which is organic, known as Temple Brewer wines. He also was passionate about making his farm carbon neutral and was growing this very tall grass to produce biochar. But he didn't know how to harvest it. And then he was chatting to Robert informally at one of our meetings, and Robert suggested they could modify a cane harvester. So together they took one of Robert's old cane harvesters down to his farm, and they used it to successfully harvest his grass so that he could produce biochar. I know that some of our listeners and viewers today know this next one, which is Lynn Strong. Lynn Strong is on a dairy south of Sydney in a beautiful part of the world. And she became so passionate about the Climate Champion program that she initiated the Young Farming Champion program, which is still active today, and doing a wonderful job at helping to mentor leaders in agricultural industry, young leaders in agriculture industry, and helping to share messages about agriculture with schools. So I'm very proud of the Climate Champion program because it's a program that changed lives and continues to change lives even though it's ended. The lessons learned from this one is the importance of supporting relationships of trust and enabling farmers to learn from each other, not just from the experts. Face-to-face informal interactions are really, really important, as is developing farmers' skills. We provided media and presentation skills training for them, also a whole lot of other skills they learnt, writing and so on, which enabled and gave them confidence to communicate with others. But it takes time. This was a 6-year program, and it takes time for those relationships of trust to develop. So it's not something that can happen overnight. Something that can happen more immediately is shown in my third example. So in mid-November last year, I was lucky enough to go to Botswana initially. And there I met up with 10 scientists from 8 different African countries who were supported through the Volkswagen Foundation to do their research. They were brought together so that we could train them in communication skills over the course of a few days. However, when you first get together, it's important we get to know each other, and so we were able to go on a game drive of the beautiful Shobi National Park in Botswana. But then it was down to business, and the next day we crossed into Namibia to a hotel on the banks of the wonderful Zambezi River full of crocodiles and hippos. But we were in the hotel, and we were, our task was to train these scientists to speak about their research in a simple way. And if any of you have ever been to any of our workshops, we don't use PowerPoint, we use a lot of practice, we use feedback. It is very much a participatory workshop in developing their skills and expertise. The exciting thing about this workshop was that after the training, these scientists were going to actually go to a community conservancy group and communicate about their research. So the trick was in how to make their research, which might be happening in South Africa or a different country in Africa, relevant to a conservancy, a poor conservancy in Namibia. So that was our challenge. And there was lots of practice, lots of videoing, lots of playing back before they were ready. But then they were ready. And you can see here, one of our participants out the front presenting his work using flip charts to the local community group. And you can see how dry this landscape is, how challenging it is to be a farmer in this landscape. And I just felt so privileged to be part of this process. But we went back to where we were staying that night, and the next day we were invited out to lunch at the local community. So here we are, all out at the local community. This is where they live. It is like in the picture books. And here a range of us are sitting waiting for our lunch. This was lunch that was served and to everyone that was there. We then listened to the local people tell their stories and their concerns. And here are two of the women from the village explaining their issues very articulately and passionately to our group. And I think it's really important to also listen to others in that process. After we went on a field trip, and here's one of the villagers explaining how they use these cans stringed across between trees to stop elephants getting into their crops. Apparently it makes such a noise that the elephants are scared and will turn around. And there were lots of times for informal interactions as well with the children in the village. So the lessons learned from this one, which had a more immediate effect, was the benefits of developing skills through participation rather than through lecturing. The importance of really understanding the local cultural context. We were lucky enough in our workshop to have one of the scientists who'd worked with that community, so they understood that community and what would be relevant to them. Providing constructive feedback is important in any of these participatory training programs. Allowing plenty of time for discussion and listening and learning from their stories is also important. So in conclusion, I live a fabulous life. I feel very lucky and privileged, and I've learnt a lot, and I hope that you enjoy your journeys as researchers in learning and interacting with who you need to as well. Thank you.
Oh, that was awesome, Jenny. That was such a diverse and incredibly interesting presentation. Like, I love how these three stories and relationships have deepened your connection to science and agriculture. And, you know, when you said history reminds us of the context we're working in, it really spoke to me. And I think it's so important, you know, to understand and work within community values and local knowledge, which is often understood better through, you know, knowing the history. Yeah, what incredible sites you've worked in and spent time with. Awesome photos as well.
I'm very lucky.
Yes. So just again, if there's any questions for Jenny or Elizabeth or the whole panel, just remember to put them in the Q&A. So now Jenn, our last panel member, will be exploring more practical skills, exploring to maximise your science communication. Thanks so much, Jenn. Take it away.
Thank you, Mia. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I just want to begin by saying, oh my goodness, Elizabeth and Jenny, thank you for sharing your stories. I'm feeling completely inadequate now because I have no experience in the agricultural world. I can't tell you any stories about working with farmers. I did choose a picture of some of the favourite farmland where I did do my PhD though. I wasn't working with farmers, I was following possums around, but maybe that gives me, you know, some small amount of credibility. But yeah, just thank you for sharing your stories, and it's a real honour to be with you today. Let me share my slide. So in fact, before I do, I guess I'll just say, given that I don't have agricultural stories or incredible photos from Africa to share with you, I decided what would be most useful for me to contribute today would be to just talk through some really practical advice and tips about science communication. So just do a 180 from the stories you've just been hearing. And, you know, my day job is to work with research students in every field in science, biomedical science, engineers, and help them become more skilled at communicating about their research, both to interdisciplinary scientific audiences, to lay audiences, and credit where it's due. Some of my really important early learnings were with Jenny when I was a PhD student, and I couldn't agree more in how important it is to be participatory when we're teaching this stuff. So me sitting here with some slides is not really my usual style, but I think, you know, it can be really helpful just to have a few tips up our sleeve. So I know that many of you are very experienced science communicators. We have some incredibly skilled and talented science communicators among us. So I'm just going to whip through some tips. I'm sure many of them will be familiar to you, but I'm hoping for everyone there might be something new and useful to take from it. So I'm just going to begin with one of my favourite quotes, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. And I guess this is the whole basis of what I do at Melbourne Uni, is that, you know, science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I guess I would extend that by saying until it's communicated to the audiences that it's relevant for and who need to hear it. Because I think certainly when I was going through being an undergrad and then into honours and a PhD student, you know, what I was kind of told or led to believe was that as long as I went to conferences and as long as I published papers in journals, that was my job. That's all I needed to do. And it was a pretty big revelation to me to then realise that, in fact, you know, the people I needed to communicate my PhD work to were the people who were living in the areas where the possum species I was studying, where they lived. You know, it was about preserving trees, you know, the whole conservation angle, and those people weren't going to be reading scientific journals. So, you know, that's what I've spent the last 10 years convincing my university, is that you should never do a science degree without also learning how to communicate effectively to different audiences. So I'm just going to start with the real basics, which I teach everybody. I'm sure it won't be news to any of you, but the very basic questions that I think we need to go through whenever you undertake any sort of communication endeavour. Always work out what your goal is first. What would a successful outcome from this communication endeavour look like? What am I actually trying to achieve in this situation? So GAMPA, obviously it's an acronym, so G is goal. Everybody knows you've got to think about your audience. Everybody hears that all the time. It's so easy to say, harder I think to actually think carefully about and understand and change how you're going to go about communicating on the basis of that audience. And the stories we've just heard, you know, are just beautiful examples of how we can target our communication according to who it is that we want to communicate with. M is message, pretty obvious. What is it that you want to say? But really important to craft it carefully in light of who your audience is and what your goal is. Because what you want to say might not be what your audience hears, depending on how you communicate it. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into thinking about our message. The P of GAMPA is platform. And I guess this one's really important because certainly amongst my students, often a student will come to me really excited because they'll say, oh, I've decided I'm going to start a blog, or oh, I want to have a Twitter account, or I'm going to do this. And they're putting platform first because they're thinking about what they want to put out into the world. But of course, the platform that you choose has to be directly informed by who is your audience, what is your goal, and what is your message. So we can't go to platform first. And then the E and the R of GAMPA are just to remind us that this is a cyclical process. You don't decide once and then say, woohoo, I'm free, I'm home, I've sorted it all out, I know exactly what I'm doing. We've always got to be evaluating the outcomes of what we're doing and be prepared to refine each of our points. So once you've got GAMPA in your head, and it's really good, I step through it all the time, I just always come back to it. I just have 3 slides that I want to speak through. One is about writing, and I've decided to focus on writing for non-scientific audiences, non-research audiences. Then I'm going to speak a little bit about public speaking, and then finally I thought we'd touch on social media. And for each of those 3 topics, I've just picked my top 7 tips to go through. And as I said, I hope that for each one of you, there'll be at least something in there that perhaps you haven't thought about before, perhaps you can take with you to reflect back on. And I guess I've chosen the top 7 from 10 years of teaching research active scientists and worked out what's been most useful for them. So my first one is pretty simple. It's just that I want you to think about how you've been taught to write. So I know I have you know, a very particular background myself, that I went through a lot of academic training and I was very much taught to write in a certain way. And it's been a revelation to me to realise that most of the rest of the world doesn't write like that and isn't very interested in reading stuff that's been written like that. And I feel like I could hazard a guess that if you also have a whole lot of research training behind you, that you've also been taught to write more or less in a particular way, where using a lot of technical language is not only fine, it's expected, it's required, where potentially quite long sentences are normal, potentially quite convoluted sentences, writing in third-person voice, writing in passive voice. You know, if any of this is sounding familiar, it's fine that you've been taught to write that way, but just be aware that you need to practice writing in a very different way when you're communicating with non-scientific audiences. And so I talk about wild audiences and wild readers and captive readers. And by this I mean that if you've gone through university study in any field of science, you become very accustomed to writing for what I call a captive audience. A captive audience is someone who has to read what you've written, whether they want to or not. So think about a lecturer, think about a thesis examiner, think about someone who, you know, they have to read your work. And so you grow accustomed to this idea that the content of what you're writing is the most important thing, rather than how you're writing it. Fast forward now to what you're doing in your careers now, and I imagine many of you are writing for a wild audience. By that I mean someone who doesn't have to read your stuff. And if it's not well written and engaging and exciting, they won't keep reading it. And this is why we now have to invest in becoming really skilled writers, because we're no longer writing most of the time for captive audiences. So this means using things like headings really effectively, particularly if people are reading on a small screen, on a phone. You know, when they get distracted and they come back, if it's just solid text on their screen, they're probably going to get lost. So breaking your writing up, accepting that people may not have to read it and you're going to have to make it really accessible for them. So headings, subheadings, topic sentences. If you haven't talked about topic sentences since you were at school, go back and look them up. It basically means it allows someone to be able to skim read your work. Always go for more simple language if you can. My bugbear is people who insist on using the word utilise. Maybe there are some situations where it's the right word, but really I think use would be fine 99% of the time. So always get rid of complex words. You don't need to use them. Active first person voice. So, you know, I know there will be some situations where that might not be okay. Obviously some journals don't like it, but many now do. So think about wherever you can, writing the way you would talk. It's a really good test. So that's why my 6th tip is everything you write, read it aloud. And if it doesn't roll off the tongue, if you feel uncomfortable saying it, it's probably not the best writing. So for a lot of my students, I get them to make their first draft of a written piece by speaking into their phone and recording it, transcribing that, and then editing that. Because as soon as you start writing it as a written document, a lot of people end up with very, you know, long, convoluted ways of writing. And my last point, I guess, is particularly for anyone who's writing a long document, you know, don't get caught up editing every sentence as you go. Editing is really important. It's essential. It takes a lot of time, but do it at the end. Just get your ideas down first and then edit later. And I think one of the great sayings about this is editing while you write is like chopping down a tree that you're trying to climb. You'll never get anywhere. All right, let's move on to public speaking. I think everybody knows how important it is to start with what everyone calls a hook, so something to grab our audience's attention, something relevant, something interesting. Lots of different things can work as a hook, a personal anecdote, an amazing statistic, you know, there's lots of things, but start with something interesting. And particularly if you have a slide behind you with your name and the title of your talk and your affiliation, you don't need to say that stuff. Obviously easy to say, harder to do. But the key thing is to remember it's not about you. This talk is not about you. This talk is about your audience, and you need to do whatever you can to connect with them. That means making genuine eye contact with everyone in the room. It means thinking about your body language. It means really having invested time in thinking about what is relevant and meaningful for them. How can you use their time well? How can you respect their time? Obviously, we've had beautiful examples of this today. I don't need to go into it. There's huge amounts of research to show how powerful stories are. The neuroscience shows very clearly that we remember stories, we connect with stories, we understand stories. Make sure people walk away with a sense of what is it that you're trying to do in a story that they're going to remember. And I think for scientists, one of the key things we need to learn with our storytelling is deciding what we can leave out. Once you work out your goal and you work out your audience, it often becomes clear that some of the things you might have felt were really important actually aren't relevant or important for this audience at all. So always ask yourself, what can I leave out? Goes without saying, and I imagine for many of you, you know, we're not thinking about situations where you're going to have PowerPoint slides behind you. I mean, Jenny's example of the flip chart was just wonderful. But if you are using slides like this, you have to be aware that our brains are no good at both listening and reading at the same time. So whenever you have text behind you, complex diagrams, anything, your audience is focused on that and they're not hearing what you're saying. So always be careful with visuals. Nerves are a thing. Nerves are good. If you're not nervous, you don't care. So please, anyone who worries about public speaking because of their nerves, this is something I teach a lot. I could speak about it for hours, but you know, my 2-minute summary is most people feel nervous. Probably everyone feels nervous. And if they don't, it's because they're not invested enough in what they're doing. So please be nervous. The trick is to recognize that physiologically, your body can't tell the difference between being very excited and being very nervous. So your inner monologue can be, I'm terrified, I'm so scared, I don't want to do this, I hate this. Or it can be, I'm so excited, I can't wait to bring it on, I'm really looking forward to giving this talk. And your body is exactly the same in terms of the stress hormones. So turn it into excitement. And if you are a nervous speaker and you're tempted to write yourself a script, either read it or memorize it, just be aware, and I'm sure you've seen this happen, it's really heartbreaking. It's a recipe for disaster. So what we all have to practice is, yes, planning carefully, yes, knowing, you know, what we're going to say in general terms, but being prepared to wing it on the day so that we're not relying on our memories. Okay, last group of tips for social media. we could talk for hours about social media, and I'm not sure how many of you are responsible for social media channels, your own or for your organisation, and I certainly don't pretend to be an expert. There's huge amounts of advice out there, but just some real basics. One is, of course, back to audience and thinking about, in the huge amount of information out there on social media, how can you provide some value to your audiences? Images, of course, we all know images are powerful, and I think we're all crazy if we don't employ images to help our messages get more traction and be seen by more eyes. Of course, the messages have to be crafted, as I said, as part of GAMPA. It's got to be short, it's got to be simple, it's got to be something that people understand exactly what you're saying and why it's important. So time spent crafting the messages really pays dividends. Now, of course, we have to choose our platforms really carefully. So anyone who doesn't know, FOMO is the fear of missing out. So we can't feel like we want to be on every platform. There's just no way that you can have time to be on every platform. So in light of your goal and your audience, think about where you should best invest your time. It's really important. Hashtags, of course, we could spend a long time talking about hashtags. The key thing to say is that hashtags matter, they're useful, they help more people to see what it is that you are trying to share. Hashtags help people to find it, and there are ways to find the right hashtags to use. I loved what Elizabeth was talking about being willing to be vulnerable, being willing to be authentic, you know, the effort that we have to put into sharing ourselves, and all of that is part of social media. I think it's really important to remember what it is that you're trying to do on social media. And my last one is just this idea of the generosity principle. And that is that a really important thing that you can do on social media is to promote other people. You know, if you're only ever sharing your own stuff and promoting your own outputs, your own stories, I think that's a pretty shallow way to use social media. So if all else fails and you're not sure what messages you want to share or what images you want to use, you know, a big part of the profile that you can build on your platform is what you share of other people's, what messages you're sharing. And I think that's something that we can all remember all the time is let's help each other, let's support each other, let's help the messages that are important to get out to the audiences that we want them to get to. So that's my super fast list of tips. I hope that there's something in there that you think, I hadn't actually sort of thought about it that way before. Maybe I can try that. And if there's any questions, I know Elizabeth and Jenny both have lots and lots of experience in all of these things as well.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. That was really helpful. I don't know about other people, but for me that was like what I needed. And it provided, you know, really useful ways that we can practice and narrow down our communication to engage with a wider audience. I have literally a really long list of things that I'm going to take away from that, and GAMPA is now my life motto, and goodbye jargon. I can see why all my Melbourne Uni friends rave about you. All right, well, they were three really awesome, interesting and informative presentations. I really love the diversity among them all, but, you know, all the connections that the presenters made with ensuring the researcher or the professional understands the community that they work with, and by listening and using simple language to find areas of commonality. So that was awesome. So now we're going to open up for a Q&A, and I was going to start it off with a question, but these Q&As are coming in strong, so I think we'll just get right into other people's. We first have one from Meredith Mitchell, and this one was directed to Elizabeth, and this says, hi, does Elizabeth have tips for engaging or understanding the farming communities we work with? I'm not sure but Elizabeth, you can interpret that as you wish.
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Thanks so much, Meredith, for the question. I guess the the key things that I found to be successful are what I articulated in my presentation around being authentic, finding common ground, seeking to understand, then to be understood. But I think one thing that I didn't include, and one thing that I find wherever I travel, certainly internationally, but even regionally within Australia, willing to get your hands dirty. I think there's a level of trust and respect that is immediately given, bestowed when, you're looking to, get an understanding. And I think when I moved to Papua New Guinea, I was there for 2 years. I think I spent 6 months listening, learning, watching, being a little sponge before I really, had any intelligent questions, I guess. And yes, I was there for 2 years, and that's a very long timeline, but I think that the same is still true with whatever community you work with. And if it's an international community, Jack's asked a question a little lower around communicating with people from different backgrounds or different languages. I think learning some of the basic language is also really helpful. So, yeah.
Great. Well, we might jump into Jack's question then. I know it's a little bit lower down, but I think the others might have some useful answers for that as well. So Jack Hetherington said, any suggestions for communicating complex sciencey things to audiences where English is a second language? He finds when communicating to audiences where English is not their native tongue, having more words and spelling in full can be helpful to them to understand the key messages. So maybe Jenny, if you wanted to start that off, and Jen, and Elizabeth, if you wanted to add more as well, that would be great.
A lot of times it's working with audience where English is not their native tongue, and if there's not a local translator available, which is what we had in the village in Namibia, which was fabulous, then it may mean using more visuals. Some of these people, depending on who it is, may be able to read English, but may not be able to understand how you speak it. Even parts of the United States don't understand how I speak English. So in that instance, if I'm giving a presentation, I will use more words. I'll use more words in a PowerPoint presentation than I ever would speaking to people who speak the same language with the same accent as me. So I think that's important. But yeah, find out how they like to receive things. It comes back to what every speaker has said, and understand who you're speaking with, and that will help.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. Jen, did you have anything that you wanted to? Oops, sorry, I just muted you again.
Yeah, I think Jenny's point is an excellent one. Obviously, with all of my tips, there are always going to be exceptions and situations where it might not quite hold true. And I think there will absolutely be times where providing more words in a written format is absolutely the right thing to do. I guess my advice was coming from the point of view where people just have slabs of text up behind them and then wonder why no one's listening to them. But I think certainly keywords it can really help to write down. I think it all comes back to GAMPO. What's the goal here? What is the key thing that you need to share with this audience? And what are creative ways that you might be able to do that in terms of, think back to the first time you ever travelled overseas and you were somewhere that you didn't speak the language and you had to use all sorts of hand signals and you had to find equivalencies and ways of coming up with things that that were common ground. I think there are all sorts of creative ways that we can do that. And I guess a lot of it comes back to so much of what Elizabeth and Jenny talked about around kind of trust and connection. And, I think there are lots of situations where the language is less important than the sense of shared vision and shared purpose. And maybe there are ways to find, there are ways to work together that don't depend on having very in-depth conversations full of complex language. But I think Jenny's other point was perfect. If there are complex ideas that need to be communicated clearly and effectively and with minimal risk of misunderstanding, then visuals are super powerful.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I'll only add one small little comment, and it's less about the sciencey, I guess, deep language or whatnot. But one thing I find really useful, certainly when I'm working in PNG. I'm always mindful as a an outsider, a white lady coming into community, and I'm very intentional of kind of reorienting relationships so we're both on the same page, rather than this kind of expert and farmer kind of weird, unhelpful relationship. So trying to flip the relationship from being vertical to horizontal. And often, I even if it's I can speak pidgin, but not well. So I kind of use it as an opportunity to show that I'm no expert. Oh, sorry, straight, speaking pidgin too good, and it kind of creates this humour, and it actually also shows, again, the vulnerability, but that you're both learning. So there's kind of, again, that common ground shared, to Jen's point around building trust. So I kind of relationships are important to me, and that's, I guess, how I see a lot of successful people do well. So, yeah.
Great. Well, that's, great answers. I agree. I think it's a challenging space, but definitely getting it as simple as you can. I think it's important. We have a question that's very different from the previous one. This one's from Tamara Jackson. She says, can you give some examples of how to create spaces for people to interact, in particular when they might have opposing views? Have any of you had experiences in this, or any advice, whoever would like to jump in?
What I think is important is to find a neutral space where both groups feel comfortable. And often farmers don't feel comfortable in a scientific space. Not that they necessarily have opposing views, but there's nothing like being out in a farm barnyard, or if it's fine, outside under a tree, sitting around for those barriers to break down. So finding a place that's comfortable for both opposing groups, I think, is really important. And it may be, and this relates to another question that someone asked, I'm never in favour of having large public meetings with diverse groups involved, which they often do in these public consultations. Whenever I've been involved in facilitating something about conflict, I like to break people into smaller groups. And in those smaller groups, you're more likely to have a dialogue than people shouting. People are more likely to listen to each other, particularly if it's facilitated well.
Do you have anything else to add, Elizabeth or Jen?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. I agree wholeheartedly on the neutral location. I've seen that within industry, but also even with something, a lived experience of mine is family farm succession. So finding a neutral ground to resolve conflict. But I think the other really important thing is to be informal in some cases, but intentional. So being, it sounds a bit silly, but setting ground rules is really important, and that way, then that empathy and respect and willingness to listen. Because some people, one of my favourite sayings, I went out to my notes and I've forgotten it. You have strong views loosely held. So you come with a sense of preparation and conviction, but you're willing to be moved.
Great. Jen, did you want to add anything? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think Jenny and Elizabeth have given fantastic responses.
Oh, well, actually, I have one case study that's really interesting, and you can look this up later. So Austral is one of the largest fishing companies in Australia. And so, heavy commercial fishing company, and they've actually partnered with Sea Shepherd, believe it or not. And it's actually, in terms of social license to operate, they're at opposing level and ends of the industry, and they've actually come together on a common ground. So this speaks to the finding a common value as well for ocean preservation. So they've both targeted illegal fishing together. So two, RS, and I've been involved in the live export debacle, so I have had been in situations where we have had opposing views, but it's possible, I guess, and that example proves exactly that.
Great. Well, we've got a question here from Hassan, and they say that just moved. The problem, especially in developing countries, is that farmers do not listen to scientific notes coming from scientists. Their language for convincing them is different from academic scientists. what should we do to minimise the problem? Jen, did you have something that you wanted to add from coming from, you know, a very academic University of Melbourne?
Well, I guess, you know, a lot of it, I think, is around self-awareness. You know, when I said I really want you to think about how you've been taught to write, I guess it's also a matter of how you've been taught to speak, the audiences that you've been trained to speak with. I think a lot of it just comes from, you know, I know it's so simple. Know your audience, respect your audience, invest time in trying to understand your audience. And if there are ways to break down the barriers, I mean, if there's nothing you can do that will encourage this group of people to listen to you, then, I mean, I don't know the situation to know if that's ever the case. I guess I would think that there's always a way to forge trust and to forge connections and to become a valuable source of information for this audience. And it's just a matter of working out how to do that. And I think what Elizabeth said before about kind of the vertical versus the horizontal is just so important, because if you position yourself as an expert who somehow knows more or knows better, of course a lot of people are going to be resisting listening to you because they don't feel that you do know better if you're coming from outside. So it's very much about trying to educate yourself and I think, again, being humble and being authentic and finding ways to demonstrate that you're someone who really cares and is trying to come and do your best, and you're not there to somehow be the expert. And there's so many ways to communicate that in terms of what you wear, how you speak, the way you position yourself in a room. I mean, I'm sure Elizabeth and Jenny have much more pertinent examples than I do of how to deal with this. But I think respect and goodwill goes a really long way. I don't know, who wants to go first with a good example, Jenny and Elizabeth?
Well, for me, it's all about relevance. And you can't have relevance unless you understand how it connects with them.
Yeah.
I mean, the example that I gave in Namibia was we had to make the research from 8 different countries relevant to a local community in Namibia. And that ranged from research looking at water in South Africa to a whole range of different types of things. Luckily enough, one of our participants had worked with the local community, and we were able, from every research project, to find a point of connection with the local community. So they were concerned about droughts. They were concerned about wildlife getting into their crops and lions attacking their livestock, which was slightly different issues for other African countries, but there were connections with wildlife in an agricultural setting. So it was about finding those connections and then making sure that each presentation emphasised those connections right from the start, so that you're engaging the audience right from the start with the context and the relevance that relates to them. If you don't relate to them right from the start, you're going to lose them completely.
Did you want to add anything to that, Elizabeth? No? All right. Well, we might just have maybe a couple more. There's a lot here to choose from, but I see that Jenny has gone through and answered a few, which has been awesome. So maybe one from Judy Mann, who says, any suggestions about bridging the science to policy divide? Has anyone got any experience or advice for that? I know that's a difficult one.
Well, the policymakers are just another group of people that you want to communicate with. So again, finding out how they like to be communicated with. And most policy people are looking for ways to make their politicians look good. So what is it that's relevant to their constituents? And go and ask them what they want to know, what they find useful from science, and make that connection. Again, what is it that's going to be relevant for them? And they're busy people. They don't have time. So don't go in with a long scientific, well thought out report. Hit them with what's the problem? What are the options that you see in dealing with that problem? And how they can invest in a solution that will be good for them and their community.
Yeah, this kind of goes into Humera's question as well, who similarly talks about policy. So how to communicate with policy people to make them aware about the value of work you do. Gamper is a great way, but would you be able to share other tips? So maybe Elizabeth and Jen, if you'd like to speak to that a bit.
I just think what Jenny said a moment ago was just gold. It's got to be about making it relevant to them. I mean, you have to convince them that they have a problem and that you know what the solution is. And if you go in waxing lyrical, you know, with a whole lot of information that you as a scientist are invested in, but to them is just, you know, irrelevant details, they're gonna tune out almost immediately, because as Jenny said, busy people with no extra time for anything irrelevant. So you need to do your homework. Who are they? What do their constituents care about? What are the problems that are facing them? And how does your research contribute to solving those problems? And then give them the punchline straight away. You know, you were taught to write in a way that you spend most of your time on background. You eventually come to identifying the problem. Then you spend all this time talking about your methods to try and fix the problem. Eventually you get to your results, and at the very end you say what it means. You know, you've got to flip it. What does it mean? That's the first thing you say. This is what we found out. This is what it means. They're very unlikely to care about the background or anything to do with how you found it out. So I think relevance is the absolute key word.
Yeah. And to, in the spirit of providing good examples, I could make that example live. So I used to be on the board for Australian Women in Agriculture, and every year we took women from across Australia, so all agricultural, majority farmers, but we also did have ag researchers and a very broad membership. Every year we went to Canberra, and that was largely to influence decision makers. So we had a process. So I guess there's a couple of points to this that sort of highlights what Jen was saying. We had a process which we did good research. We got our key messages. We presented it in verbal form, in written form. We got the right people, the ones that actually, the key people that influence policy and have the ear of the minister. It does take a bit of networking and whatnot to find those people. And then the critical, and to Jenny's point, make them look good. Yep. And the other thing that I will emphasise is that solving a problem is much better than putting a problem up. And the final thing I'll say is follow up. We did that every year, and it actually then, we were then the go-to people. So when there was a particular thing that needed to be consulted on, we had an active membership that understood the process, and we were able to provide that input.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it sounds, all of you, what you've all said is just like, I think it's really important to kind of understand that as well. Maybe one last question, and I guess if you, Jenny and Elizabeth, could talk about how you came to work in these communities. So Chantal has asked, there are certain communities within agriculture that are overstudied than others. Approaching such communities is very, very challenging. Any suggestions and comments on this issue would be appreciated. So how did you guys find these communities or connect with them and continue working over the years?
I definitely take the point that there's communities that are overstudied, in that they've been consulted to death, and that's in Australia and overseas. So why go in again? My premise is always to find out what's already out there about that community. What do we already know from consultation, past research about that community? And then start from that point. Just don't go and ask the same old questions in that space. And whenever you're doing consultation with the community, always provide feedback about what you did with that consultation information and what that means, and value their time and in participating in that consultation process. That's what I think.
I would echo, in fact, they were the 2 points that I was going to say exactly. So I'm glad we're on the same page, Jenny. The other thing that I would add, and this is by virtue, so this is from experience with the program that I coordinate up in PNG. So 5 disparate ACR research projects, and particularly one of our projects in Bougainville. It is an overstudied region, and so the project was very intentional about what communities it worked with. Beyond that, these 5 projects that are working in quite distinct areas, we have I put together a bi-monthly update, and it's those kind of snippets of opportunity to see, to learn from each other, but also to ensure that it's not just siloed research. There's actually a collaboration across working in a particular region or in a particular field. And that kind of informal update and ensures that people know what's happening within country and within a region.
Great, yeah. Well, it's such amazing areas that you're all working in, and yeah, it would be great to kind of have more time, I guess. And we could talk about, I'm sure you could all talk about science communication in your respective fields all day, and you do, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you so much for you, Elizabeth, Jenn and Jenny, for taking the time today to talk to all of us about your experiences in science communication and your knowledge. It's been extremely interesting and informative, and especially, you know, for me, hopefully continuing study into a PhD next year, I'll definitely be taking all of this into my knowledge head and be communicating amazingly if I practice everything that you've said today. So if you'd like to get hold of any of the panel, just email Raid or get in contact with us, and we can provide those emails or websites or whatnot. And I think some of the panel may have provided that within the chat. So I think all of us will be walking away from this better science communicators, like I know that I will for sure. And before we just go and talk science with our not so sciencey friends and tell them about all the great stuff that we're doing in the science world or the agricultural world, I just wanted to quickly discuss our next RAID webinar, which will be hosted by the partnerships team, about an exciting volunteer opportunity with Australian Volunteers International and the Vietnam National University of Agriculture. This webinar will be held on the 31st of July, so you'll hear more about that in the next coming weeks, and we hope to see you at that one as well. Once again, thank you so much, Elizabeth, Jenn and Jenny. It's been such a pleasure to be hosting this webinar today, and all the best.
Thank you
for having us.